On behalf of our Board of Trustees, I'd like to welcome Secretary Taylor, Mr. Allman, the Secretary of State of Maryland, all of you students and faculty members to this, the 9th Annual Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs Foreign Policy Panel for Maryland's colleges. We're delighted to have all of you here. On behalf of the Governor, Secretary of State Allman has a greeting.
Thank you, Dr. Byrd. It's a privilege to be here today on behalf of Governor Ehrlich and to give greetings to all of you and wish you well in as many of you in your studies as we listen to Ambassador Byrd today, Ambassador Taylor today on an issue that affects all of us a great deal. In the past, I think many of us have focused greatly on issues of security on a national level, and we found out during the past several years on how critical it is on a state level and a local level. And the governor this morning even mentioned that to a reporter when asked what the most interesting and compelling part of his first several months in office were, and he said that the Homeland Defense component of what faces Maryland. So on behalf of Governor Ehrlich, I welcome all of you here and wish you very, very best wishes from him and from all of us in Annapolis. And I'd like to, at this point, welcome Ambassador Taylor and as he addresses us this afternoon. Thank you.
You all know that the question of terrorism is on the minds of most of us. The United States, of course, has been vulnerable for decades to weapons of mass destruction. We also know that delivery systems have become much more flexible over the years, but only with 9/11 did it become strikingly clear to all Americans the enormous damage which can be done by a very modest delivery system to the United States. And from 9/11, we didn't have mere ripples, we had waves spinning out, damaging our economy, our state of mind, and influencing our foreign policy. The problem is enormously complex, as all of you know. We're very, very pleased that the State Department has been good enough to share with us this afternoon their Assistant Secretary of State for Diplomatic Security, the gentleman who has been the State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism since 2001, and a gentleman who's had a very distinguished career in the United States Air Force. Mr. Taylor, Secretary Taylor, rose to the rank of Brigadier General. He was in charge of Air Force Special Investigations. For all you students, he's a graduate of Notre Dame, class of 1970. He holds his master's degree in government and international relations from that same institution. He holds a most important position today. It's my great pleasure to present to you Mr. Francis X. Taylor.
Well, good afternoon. We have to make sure everyone's awake for this session today. Good afternoon. It's my military upbringing, I'm sorry. And especially you midshipmen there, I'm sure you would respond immediately to those kinds of calls. I'm delighted to be here today, and on behalf of Secretary of State Colin Powell, bring you greetings from the Department of State and my colleagues in the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, and in my former position as Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism. I've been given a very tough job today, and that is to put a policy perspective on the global war on terrorism. And that's difficult because some would say that the memory of at least the events instant after 9/11 have faded. They have not faded for me. On 9/11, I happened to be standing in front of television, as many people were, having just finished a staff meeting. Secretary Powell was in Lima, Peru. Deputy Secretary Armitage had just ended our staff meeting. We have one at 8:30 every morning. Came down to my office, and I was getting ready for my staff meeting, and at 8:46, someone came into the office and said, "Did you see what happened?" And I always keep a news show on in my office. I won't tell you which one, but it has 3 letters. And I looked, and the first thought was a private plane had somehow veered off course. Then at 9:06, the second plane flew into the South Tower. I got a call from Rich Armitage, the Deputy Secretary. He said, "Frank, this is terrorism. Get up here." And from 9:15 that morning until a year later, I did not have a day off, nor did your government have a day off, in working the strategy that we would build to respond to that attack. More than 3,000 Americans and people from more than 80 countries around the world were murdered on 9/11 in New York, in Washington, D.C., at the Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania. And indeed, had the passengers on the one jet not taken action, certainly that jet was headed towards a target in our nation's capital. That was a day that killed the innocence of America in terms of our understanding of the threat of terrorism. That was a day when terror struck at the heart of our homeland, but more importantly, and I think it's very important to understand that it not only struck Americans hard, but it's the first time in the history of the world that an actual terrorist event was broadcast live worldwide. And I can't tell you how many calls we received in the State Department, we received in the White House, and Americans received from around the world, from people who were in Timbuktu. They were all over the place, and they saw the CNN, the Fox News, the BBC coverage of this, and it was over and over and over again. And it touched their humanity. And that's where I think bin Laden and al-Qaeda miscalculated. As sophisticated as he thought he was, he did not understand the power of the media and the fact that the world would see this not as a strike against only America, but as a strike against humanity. And the reaction from the world in responding to the President's call on the 20th of September to form a global war on terrorism, a coalition as great as our country has ever called for that would form to strike out at this threat called terrorism. And being a military person, we generally think of war in the sense of we give the orders to the military, they form the war plans, they go off and execute the military operation, they come home, and then the war is over. But the President said this would be the most unique war we had ever fought. And it would be unique because we would bring to bear against this enemy our military, our diplomatic, our law enforcement, our intelligence, and our economic power, and that of our coalition in a coordinated, worldwide effort to target an enemy that, by its very nature, is hidden, is unknown to us. And therefore, we needed to coordinate those various elements of power in order to be effective. Now, many will remember on the 7th of October when we started our military operations in Afghanistan, and that was the visible face, the first visible face of the war on terrorism. And it was visible because we saw it every day on CNN, just as we see our young men and women who are fighting another terrorist foe in Iraq today. By our military actions, we began the first part of our strategy, and that was to deny the enemy a sanctuary. That sanctuary was Afghanistan. But few will remember that before we conducted military operations, the President delivered a démarche to the Taliban. And that démarche said that you should comply with UN Security Council Resolution 1333. that essentially said, shut down the terrorist camps and render bin Laden and his leadership team to justice. The Taliban again refused. And throughout the year before September the 11th and October the 7th, we had been engaged in a dialogue, a discussion, if you will, with the Taliban to get UN Security Council Resolution 1333 implemented. They failed to meet their international obligations, therefore the need for military force to make that happen. And the world joined us in that coalition. I had the honor of representing the nation at the North Atlantic Council on the 5th of October, prior to the commencement of hostilities, when I briefed the North Atlantic Council on the case against bin Laden and al-Qaeda, why we believed that the attack on September 11th had come from outside the United States. And as a result of that briefing, the North Atlantic Council voted to lift the if clause from the Article 5 treaty, the Washington Treaty, which said that the attack on 9/11 was an attack on a member of NATO, and the first time that NATO had a responsibility to join with the United States to go after that enemy. Similarly, the OAS joined us, the EU joined us, ASEAN joined us, the Australia, New Zealand, U.S. Organization joined us in a military campaign against the Taliban. And it was a very effective military campaign. Al-Qaeda's infrastructure was destroyed. They have no ability any longer to conduct military operations from Afghanistan. The Taliban have been defeated. We now have President Karzai and the interim government elected by the people of Afghanistan in their own traditional way, using the Loya Jirga, to begin a new beginning of an Afghanistan that will not be a threat to its partners and to its neighbors in the region, and will be focused again on providing what the people of Afghanistan needed. We flushed out al-Qaeda. We captured more than 7,000 al-Qaeda fighters, Taliban fighters, many of whom have been turned over to the Afghan authorities for prosecution. Others have been incarcerated as enemy combatants at Guantanamo as we continue our global campaign against the unseen members of al-Qaeda. But that was the visible part. What was the invisible part? The invisible part was what we did at the United Nations as we used diplomacy to get the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 1373, which essentially made it illegal for any nation in the world to allow terrorists or terrorist organizations designated by the UN to raise funds, to bank their funds, to use those countries as conduits for terrorist financing. The first strike in our effort to undermine the ability of terrorist groups to use charities and other legitimate organizations to secrete, steal, divert money for terrorist events. Terrorism is very cheap. Estimates say that the cost of the 9/11 operation in total, from planning to execution, was $500,000. And unlike money laundering, where you're looking for large sums of money, we're looking to shut down small sums of money as it moves through the world's financial markets. We have built an infrastructure within our government and working with the UN to build a worldwide net to capture terrorist funds. And to date, more than $125 million in terrorist funds have been taken off the street. That is, they are no longer available to fund the type of operations that we saw on 9/11. Now, terrorism today is not like what terrorism was, let's say, in a place like Greece in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where people had real jobs and did their terrorism at night. Terrorism is an industry. Al-Qaeda provided for the welfare of its people. It supported their families. It provided housing. It had to collect money to do that in addition to supporting people like the 19 hijackers that came here. That takes money. And in order to choke it off, we must attack that money. Attacking Afghanistan alone would not have ended the phenomenon of al-Qaeda, and therefore the financial aspects of our terrorist campaign became very, very important. Law enforcement. Law enforcement has truly, over the years, been the most effective tool that any nation has had to defeat terrorists and terrorist groups. That is, to bring them to justice. Uniquely with al-Qaeda, as a worldwide terrorist organization, we needed the cooperation of every law enforcement agency around the world. And we got it. We have had, since the 12th of September, an international dragnet that has netted the arrest of more than 3,500 members of al-Qaeda. Those people are not on the streets today plotting terror against innocent people around the world. There are many more out there, and we continue to work with our partners around the world to bring to justice those individuals that we can arrest, we can fine, we can bring to the bar of justice and have them judged for their crimes. The key to that is intelligence, and intelligence sharing and intelligence cooperation among the nations, and another pillar of our grand strategy, that we would work with the intelligence agencies of the world in ways that we had never worked before. Indeed, in responding to 9/11, and I would add, there's been a great debate. Our nation has followed the debate in the UN as our nation made the very difficult but correct decision to lead a coalition of the willing into Iraq, that somehow the global war on terrorism would be affected by that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our friends that committed to work with us on the global war on terrorism, while some disagree with the administration's policy on Iraq, are nonetheless continuing to work with us as we go after al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda-related organizations around the world. And the key, again, to that has been our intelligence exchange with friends seen and unseen, people that you would expect to work with us, and people that in your wildest imagination you wouldn't expect would have given us information to help us find al-Qaeda. But I remind you, al-Qaeda threatened humanity. 9/11 was an attack against humanity, and many nations, most nations, save one, actually two, voiced utter outrage at that act that they saw on 9/11. So with intelligence, we are able to empower our military, we're able to empower law enforcement. Indeed, you've seen in our own country a convergence of the missions of the FBI and the CIA. Not convergence in terms of the CIA doing the FBI's job or vice versa, but convergence of the use of information that's gathered from law enforcement operations and intelligence operations in enabling both law enforcement and our military to actually go out and target terrorist camps or to go out and arrest individuals involved in terrorism. And indeed, as you followed the saga, I am sure, of this Ryzen arrest that occurred in the UK a couple months ago, where al-Qaeda operatives were arrested in the UK with Ryzen residue. That arrest led to arrests in Germany, in Spain, and in several other Middle Eastern countries, because now we have the linkages that allow us to share the intelligence and move that intelligence to the appropriate law enforcement agency for action. And the appropriate action is to arrest these people and take them off the street. And finally, because it's my business today, diplomacy. Diplomacy supports, is the foundation for which all the other aspects of our national power and that of our coalition come together. I had again the honor on the 19th of September to travel with Deputy Secretary Armitage to Moscow to meet with Deputy Foreign Minister Trubnikov as we were preparing the diplomatic, we were doing the diplomatic preparation of the battle space for our military operations in Afghanistan. And having spent the majority of my adult life, some 31 years in U.S. counterintelligence, you can imagine how I felt sitting with two former KGB generals who used to be my adversaries at a table discussing how we were going to work together in Central Asia against this phenomenon called al-Qaeda terrorism, and getting the support from the Russians that they would join our coalition and be of direct assistance to us as we took on al-Qaeda working out of Central Europe. Traveled to Beijing, China in December to meet with the Chinese after President Bush had met with President Jiang Zemin in Shanghai in October to initiate the first U.S.-China counterterrorism dialogue. That dialogue had led to the Chinese supporting not only our military operations, but our worldwide security effort against the al-Qaeda and other like organizations. The point is that through our diplomacy, we were able to provide the foundation that allowed the continued cooperation of all the other elements of national power, be it at the EU, be it at ASEAN in the Asia-Pacific region, be it at the OAS. I had 150,000 frequent flyer miles from 2001 to 2002. Secretary Powell kept me quite busy working on the coalition, as busy as he was also. But the point was, it was diplomacy on the leading edge of the spear. Today, when we think about the war on terrorism, be you working in Treasury, be you working in defense, be you working in State Department, the FBI, or CIA, we're all warriors. Be ye American citizens, as you have been steadfast in allowing our government to reorganize and to bring on board a Homeland Security Department that helps again to integrate our national power here at home as we defend ourselves from this threat. You too have been warriors in the global war on terrorism. I wish I could stand here and tell you that the war is going to be over soon. The President said in September of 2001 that this would be the top issue on his agenda when he ran for re-election in 2004 and probably through that term. This is not a short-term problem. This is not a problem that's going to go away tomorrow. Indeed, we just heard yesterday that bin Laden had called for renewed jihad against America and our allies based upon the military action in Iraq. These people are seriously focused on trying to bring down America and our way of life. And we will not stand idly by and allow that to happen, nor will our friends. And terrorism knows no politics. This is truly a global issue requiring a global response for us to be successful in a global world. We are interconnected, and without that global connection, we will never be successful against these individuals. I think I'll stop there, and I know you probably have many questions based upon some of the things that I have laid out here, and I'd be happy to respond to your questions.
The first question is, do you expect to win the war on terrorism? Can we see an end to it? Secondly, is it convenient for policy purposes to continue to talk about a war on terrorism? And the third question was, do we have a working definition of terrorism? I guess that's simple enough. Do we?
The security apparatus of states less democratic than our own is there a trap of implicitly accepting their definition of terrorism in their own context?
The add-on was there are dangers in accepting other people's definition of terrorism. What is our definition?
First question, I don't know. But we're not going to stop until we have ended terrorism as a legitimate political tool, and that is the murder of innocent civilians for political reasons. So when is that going to happen? I don't know. But we have to attack that as hard and everywhere that we can find it around the world. And indeed, 10 years, 20 years, Al-Qaeda and its operations use many of the Islamic madrasas to do training of its cadres. There are many young men, sub-teenage men that are young boys that have trained through those systems. Whether they will continue to harbor those feelings for the long term, I don't know. But wherever it is, we will have to fight it. The whole notion, and we've been trying to define terrorism for years, and you get this one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. One man's use of terror becomes a human rights abuse in the eyes of someone else. It's a very difficult phenomenon to define in an international sense that everyone will agree. My definition is pretty simple. If you murder innocent human beings, innocent civilians for political purpose, you're a terrorist. If you run around and cut off the arms of men, women, and children to get political gains, you're a terrorist. And we should go after people that do those things because they're criminals. And we'll let the UN and others try to debate and define it, but it's been a difficult thing to do. But we can't ignore the fact that people who are engaged in that type of behavior are criminals and need to be dealt with while we're trying to make that definition.
Is Homeland Security on the local level getting sufficient funding?
Well, of course, I work in the State Department, so I could really avoid that question, but I won't. I have had the honor of working very closely with Governor Ridge since he took over as the President's Director of Homeland Security in the White House, and then now as the Secretary of Homeland Security. Our challenge has been to get organized appropriately and then to figure out a reasonable funding stream for federal, state, and local. And I know that that is a major concern of Governor Ridge, particularly as we've gone through the color alert systems. I know alert stage orange is very, very expensive, not only for state and locals, it's expensive for the federal agencies that have to implement those measures that are called for under the varying states of alert. We are very concerned about that. The President is very concerned about that, and I think you will see in the coming weeks and months tremendous efforts by Secretary Ridge and the Department of Homeland Security to begin to address those issues. I can't tell you specifically what there will be, but there's really concern back in Washington for what you've just described and how we work with our state partners and our local partners to ease the burden and make Homeland Security a much more efficient operation with the funding that's needed to do that. It's expensive, and there's just no way around it, and we have to come up with ways to do it better.
Is the use of military force too blunt an instrument in the war on terrorism? And do we pay sufficient attention to the underlying discontents in the Arab world and elsewhere?
From day one, it may not, again, be obvious, but from day one it was clear at the highest levels of our government and throughout the officials that were working on this was more than just a military problem, more than just a law enforcement problem. Indeed, the President talked about that, and if you go back and listen to his speech on the, I believe it's the 20th of September, to the joint session of Congress, he acknowledged this fact, that America needed to understand why young men would want to do what they're doing. What is it in their view of us as a society that makes them hate us so much that they would do those things. And indeed, since 9/11, we have been engaged very, very widely in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, with scholars and others asking that very question and getting feedback on it. But you can't just do that. One has to also be able to fight fire with fire. Bin Laden was not at a point where he was ready to talk to us any longer, to engage in a dialogue about why we act the way we do and why the world as he sees it is not the world that we're willing to live in. So sometimes you have to act in order to take care of a threat while you continue the dialogue. You mentioned Iraq, and certainly Saddam Hussein had every chance for 10 years to rid himself of weapons of mass destruction, to stop oppressing his people, and he chose not to do that. It wasn't the United States of America alone that passed the UN Security Council resolutions against Iraq and what was going on there. It was the Security Council. The reason we're in Iraq today is because the Security Council could not decide to take action at a time when we felt we were threatened and needed to take action. So I agree with you that there is more to this than what guns or law enforcement or Treasury action brings, but sometimes those are the right tools to be used in a circumstance because of the threat that's presented to you. And that doesn't take away from the fact that we are working every day with our allies, our friends, and our foes around the world in a very open and honest dialogue about what is the difference. Why do people perceive this? And oh, by the way, it's not just about America. Bin Laden would like to overthrow all of the regimes in the Persian Gulf because in his view, they are not legitimate Islamic governments. So it's not just about America. It's about his worldview and imposing that worldview on the West and others in a violent fashion.
How do you deal with the complexity of not profiling Muslims in the current context?
As an African American, it's a very difficult question, but I will tell you that profiling is lazy law enforcement. And I've said it publicly in many fora before. The fact is we've got to balance what we know from intelligence, what we know from whence the threat comes, and try to build programs that allow us to effectively investigate and screen while not profile, not sit on the side of the road and just because you're driving black at night with the Mercedes up a road, someone thinks that you're a drug dealer or something. It's difficult to do. It's not easy. It takes a lot of good people who are working very hard to try to get beyond the notion that this is profiling and that it is indeed effective law enforcement use of intelligence. The fact is the people that threaten us today are Arabic, Pakistani, Egyptian. That's fact when you look at the people who perpetrated that. So that's where you start, but that's not where you finish. And as terrorists, as we found when we went into Afghanistan, there were Caucasians, there were Russians, there were other Europeans in the camps there. So our scope has broadened. Let me speak a little bit about the dangers of counterterrorism. I was in China and I was asked the question, are you going to give up on your human rights push in China for counterterrorism return? The fact is, good counterterrorism is good human rights policy. Good human rights policy is good counterterrorism. Effective, honest, and law enforcement is good counterterrorism. Denying people their rights plays into the hands of our enemies because that is exactly what they want us to do. They want us to change our democracy. So while we must go after bad folks, and in some cases use intelligence to try to screen through. The one thing I know that the President is concerned about every day is the fact that we not change our democracy, our values, the things that we hold dear as Americans, because that's who we are. And when we begin to change those things, when we begin to act like our adversaries act, we will have played into their hands and we will be losing. I don't think we're at that point, have been or are at that point now.
The question is, within the difficulties of dealing with a post-war Iraq, what are the prospects for democratization?
Well, first, I wouldn't argue that we're answering terrorism with terrorism. While as a military professional, I will tell you that there is no war that you can get involved in where innocent people aren't killed. But I would defy anyone who has any degree of knowledge of military tactics to look at U.S. military tactics and call it terrorism. We have the most precise rules of engagement, the most precise method of delivering ordnance of any country in the world. We go through, and I understand your point. Well, but there are people who see it that way, and I want to be very clear here that the United States military takes the protection of human life, the protection of innocent life, very seriously in how we conduct military operations. Doesn't mean we're going to not stop to go do what we're asked to do. But your question had to do with installing democracy, and I think the President spoke to that today, as a matter of fact. He and Prime Minister Blair, and he said, you know, the Iraqi people will decide how they want to govern themselves. It was very, very important in Afghanistan that after the fighting was over and the Taliban were defeated, that the Afghan people came together to decide how they wanted to govern Afghanistan using the traditional Loya Jirga. And certainly imposing a political philosophy never works. You know, one looks at the history of our own country in terms of how long it's taken our democracy to mature and to be encompassing of all Americans. It took a while. So I, for one, don't believe that we're going to be able to impose any form of government on Iraq. What we will hopefully do is provide the stability that will allow the Iraqi people to decide how they want to govern themselves in the future, as with Afghanistan, and that they will make a choice to focus on their own prosperity and not a choice to build weapons of mass destruction that threaten their regional partners and their neighbors.
Two questions. The first, I think, is a version of why didn't we go to Baghdad in 1991? And the second question was why wasn't our counterterrorism more effective? Example, people being able to get on an aircraft, and examples of bin Laden and the possible arrest of him.
Let's see, in 1991, I was a colonel in Korea. No, that's not the answer. Your first question is a reasonable question. It's a question on the minds of many Americans. And the fact is, we did not think the threat was as serious. Worldwide, it wasn't just in America. You got to remember that, you know, in Germany at the Hamburg Technical University, Mohammed Atta and his group spawned this idea of coming to do this attack. We thought we could handle bin Laden and terrorism using solely law enforcement. That's what we thought. That's what the world thought. The world wasn't cooperating. Well, they're terrorists. They're against America, so we won't worry about them in certain countries around the world as long as they're not targeting us, called safe havens. That's the way people thought about terrorists until 9/11. So you're right. We didn't consider them the kind of threat that we saw in 9/11. We were taking action, however, intelligence action, law enforcement action. Bin Laden was since '98 a convicted criminal. I mean, a person under indictment. But we were trying to get him using law enforcement means, which weren't effective when the countries of the world, Afghanistan, didn't help us bring him to justice, didn't render him to us as we had asked for.
Occasionally, this question is asked, is the war today carrying out a grudge against Saddam on the part of the President of the United States because his father was targeted for assassination by Saddam?
I think nothing could be further from the truth. And there's, coming back to the earlier question, why didn't we go to Baghdad in 1991? We didn't go to Baghdad in 1991 because the UN mandate was to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And we did that, and President Bush and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, decided that the mission was completed and therefore they didn't go further. We did take up the issue of Iraq in the UN and did so for 12 years, focusing on weapons of mass destruction. And it became clear, and even more clear, that as Saddam Hussein was defying the UN, as he kicked out UN inspectors in 1998, as he continued to build weapons of mass destruction in defiance of the international community. You know, a lot of people think that, you know, this notion of getting another UN Security Council resolution was the first time we thought about doing this. We've been doing this for 12 years. The reason the President acted when he did act, because he believes, and his decision was based on the fact that he believes that Saddam Hussein and the regime in Baghdad presented a threat to the use of these weapons, and we needed to take that threat out, and that inspections would no longer be effective because of the actions of the government to cover up the fact that they were building these things.
Especially in light of comments about Syria and Iran perhaps supplying weapons to Saddam and the comments of the Secretary of Defense, would you comment on our future policy towards Syria and Iran?
Both Syria and Iran are on the list of the 7 state sponsors of terrorism, and we've been actively engaged in a multitude of fora with the Syrians, with the Iranians on this issue of getting out of the business of supporting terrorism. We are quite concerned about people coming across the Syrian border, as indicated by Secretary Rumsfeld, as well as similar action from Iran. I won't predispose what the President's prerogatives may be, except that he has been very clear consistently that support for terror by any state is unacceptable within the world community. And neither Iran nor Syria have renounced or have done what is necessary to convince the world that they no longer support terrorism. Syria is very active in supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, as is Iran. They are focused on undermining the peace process in the Middle East. We are focused, the President just announced 2 weeks ago his new Middle East initiative to try to get moving towards a state where you would have an Israeli and a Palestinian state living side by side within the Middle East. We are committed to doing that. But you can't do that in an environment where you don't have peace, stability. And terrorist operations in those areas continue to undermine our efforts to do that. So we're hoping that Syria and Iran stop supporting Hezbollah and Hezbollah terrorist activity and fundraising around the world, and that we can not move from Iraq to the Middle East, but simultaneously also work on the Middle East peace process towards the goal that the President has announced.
Do we turn our back on terrorists within the United States?
That's an excellent question. And it's excellent because I mentioned the fact that there's a lot that goes on in the war on terrorism that you don't see. We are engaged against all of those people every day. Every day. COINTELPRO was when you weren't even born, and I was a second lieutenant. And, by the way, all the people involved in COINTELPRO were disciplined for excesses. Many of them were. As a matter of fact, we changed our whole approach to intelligence collection in the United States of America based upon that operation back in the early 70s. So I don't think there's a linkage between COINTELPRO and what you're seeing today. The fact is the FBI is actively engaged in investigations against hate groups, actively engaged in bringing to justice people who are involved in hate activity. The problem in America, though, is we can't arrest you for what you think about. A thing called the Constitution. You have to act in America, and a lot of these people do a lot of talking. You know, they do a lot of talking about what they hate, what they don't hate. They do harass people, and that is against the law. But in America, in order to arrest somebody, you arrest them for their behavior, not for what they think. And we defend. It's kind of interesting. I was at a meeting once, and I had an individual who perhaps didn't think African Americans should be Americans, and listened to what he had to say, and told him, "I am so proud to defend your right to say that. I don't agree with you." That's the nature of who we are as Americans. And so I accept the fact that there are terrorists in America. Timothy McVeigh was arrested, convicted, and executed for his crimes. And any other person that conducts that kind of activity within the United States will, we hope, suffer the same fate. They will be arrested, prosecuted, and if convicted, punished for their behavior. We're not just looking overseas, we're looking across the broad spectrum of people who are involved in this type of behavior.
Is there a danger that our preoccupation, if you will, with terrorism will lead to no longer paying close attention to human rights abuses, such as in China?
We just released the Human Rights Report, and we're as critical of China as we've been in the past on its human rights. Lauren Craner, the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, my counterpart from counterterrorism, is actively engaged across the world. And indeed, we share the podium, or share it at times, on issues of human rights and counterterrorism. We do not believe, nor do we believe the record demonstrates that we have sacrificed one for the other. Indeed, they complement each other. The China example is a good one because when I went to China in December 2001, the Chinese had always argued with us that there were separatists in northwest China, the Uyghurs, who were involved in al-Qaeda terrorism. We didn't believe them until we found Uyghurs in Afghanistan and in Uzbekistan with al-Qaeda, which is why, based upon that specific factual evidence, we designated the East Turkestan Islamic movement as a foreign terrorist organization. So very carefully we analyzed it, and if they were involved in terrorism, we have indicated so in a designation, but we have not, and I've made that point very clear to my Chinese friends, that counterterrorism is not an excuse for poor human rights. And we make it every time we talk counterterrorism with the Chinese and any other government around the world.
What are the prospects in Afghanistan, and what does that tell us for Iraq?
I was in Kabul about 2 months ago and had the pleasure of meeting President Karzai. He has a tough job. He has a tough job trying to bring together a country that has been involved in civil war or some type of strife for 23 years. We are committed to working with President Karzai and the people of Afghanistan towards success. So I'm confident that with our current commitment and the commitment of the world, indeed the world is invested about, or promised, it's not all there yet, $4.5 billion in reconstruction for Afghanistan to bring to the Afghan people the things that they need to survive and to feel that they are prospering and getting better. And I'm optimistic that we're going to be successful. If we're not successful, we'll create the environment for future terrorism. And as we've seen on 9/11, we can't allow that to happen. There are lessons for Iraq. Very simply that the Iraqi people have to make the decision. We have been very careful. There's not an American flag flying with any of our troops. This is not about America taking territory. This is not about imposing American values on the Iraqi people. It's about allowing the Iraqi people without the anvil of Saddam Hussein to make their decisions about their future in a way we hope that will not threaten their neighbors in the world. And let me, if I might, sir, as you look across America, and my secretary is very good and eloquent, much more than I, in talking about this, ask yourself how many places America has gone to take land. We're not a conquering people. We're not a people today that go forth and use our military forces to take over land. We've liberated more Muslims in the last decade of the 20th century than we've liberated any other people. Ask the people of Kosovo. Ask the people of Serbia. Ask the people of Kuwait. That's not who we are as Americans. And we hope that in our action in Iraq, that our critics will be silenced by the results that come from that very difficult decision made by our president.
Well, I thought the question was going to be whether it should be the UN or the United States, but it's a much tougher question. Is it the State Department or the Defense Department?
I was a soldier, actually an airman for 31 years, so I never had a lot of opportunity to do public speaking, at least to such august audiences on such very broad issues. But you never get in trouble quoting the president. The president said this morning, it'll be the Iraqi people that will govern Iraq. And the discussion of whether it's State Department or the Department of Defense is irrelevant. This is about giving the Iraqi people the opportunity to make their decisions about their future. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, in addition to our thanks to our speaker, we thank you for your wonderful questions.